What if the loneliest depths of the human heart, hardened by isolation and the world's harsh truths, found an improbable beacon of life in the most unexpected of souls? A black woodsman, weathered by silent years and the untamed wilderness, discovered that the rawest form of purpose lay not in solitude, but in the chaotic, demanding embrace of a white widow and her 3 vulnerable children. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. The wind, a ceaseless lament through the ancient pines, was the only companion Jedediah had known for a decade. His cabin, a skeletal structure of rough-hewn logs, stood defiant against the encroaching forest, a testament to a life stripped down to its bare, unyielding necessities. Every swing of his axe, a rhythmic thud against the defiant grain of the timber, was a prayer, a penance, a dull echo of a past he meticulously buried beneath layers of solitude and unforgiving labor. His hands, calloused and scarred, were the instruments of his survival, the only language he truly understood. He was a man carved from the very land he inhabited, stoic and unyielding, his skin the color of rich earth, his eyes the deep, unfathomable brown of a forgotten riverbed. Yet beneath that stoicism, a hollow chamber existed, a space where the ghost of a softer man, a less burdened man, occasionally stirred. He was a creature of habit, a silent sentinel of the woods, his existence a stark, brutal poem written in sweat and splinters. The forest, with its indifferent cruelty and its stark beauty, was his only confidant, its secrets mirroring his own. He sought no company, offered no solace, and expected none in return. His life was a narrow path, meticulously trod, avoiding the wider world and the complicated, treacherous terrain of human connection. But the forest, like fate itself, held surprises, whispers that could shatter the most formidable walls. And on one particular morning, amidst the usual symphony of birdsong and rustling leaves, an unfamiliar sound, a faint, desperate cry, pierced the familiar silence, a sound that promised to unravel the tightly woven fabric of his meticulously constructed solitude. It was a cry that demanded recognition, a plea that could not be ignored, pulling him from his comfortable, if barren, existence. He had always believed himself impervious to such disturbances, a rock in a relentless current, but this sound was different. It held the raw, untamed essence of profound need, echoing something he thought long dead within his own chest. Word count, 432. The cry led him to the edge of the old logging road, a scar across the forest floor, where a derelict wagon lay tilted like a broken bird, its wheels splintered, its canvas torn. What he saw there was a tableau of utter desolation, stark against the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. A woman, pale and gaunt, her dress mud-streaked, clutched a small, shivering child to her chest, while 2 older children, wide-eyed and gaunt as wraiths, clung to her skirts. Their faces, smudged with dirt and streaked with tears, bore the stark imprint of fear and hunger, a silent accusation against a world that had seemingly abandoned them. Jedediah stood for a long moment, a towering, silent silhouette against the morning light, observing them with an unnerving stillness. His first instinct, honed by years of self-preservation, was to retreat, to vanish back into the comforting anonymity of the trees. This was not his burden, not his fight, not his problem. His life was carefully curated, devoid of such messy, demanding complications. He knew the dangers of involvement, the treacherous currents of attachment, the pain that inevitably followed the breaking of bonds. Yet, something held him, a flicker of something ancient and unyielding within his chest, a memory of a time when empathy was not a luxury he could afford to discard. The woman, sensing his presence, looked up. Her eyes, a startling blue against her pale face, held a desperate, animalistic plea. They were eyes that had seen too much, endured too many losses, yet still retained a spark of defiant hope. "Please," she whispered, her voice a raw rasp. "We're lost. We're starving." The words hung heavy in the air, a blunt instrument against Jedediah's carefully constructed indifference. He saw not just a woman and children, but a mirror reflecting the world's brutal indifference, a world he had chosen to escape, but which now, inexplicably, stood at his doorstep. He swallowed, the taste of dry leaves in his mouth. To turn away would be to condemn them, to become complicit in their suffering. To help them would be to invite chaos, to shatter the fragile peace he had painstakingly built around himself. The decision was not a simple one. It was a battle waged silently within the deep trenches of his own conflicted soul. A soul that had long ago forgotten how to navigate the intricate landscape of human connection. The weight of their gaze was a physical thing, pressing upon him, demanding an answer he was not prepared to give, but also one he found he could not entirely deny. Word count 431. His offer was terse, blunt. Come, my cabin. It was not an invitation, but a command, devoid of warmth yet carrying the undeniable weight of necessity. The woman Mary gathered her children. Sarah, the eldest, a quiet girl with eyes too old for her years. Thomas, a rambunctious boy who looked at Jedediah with a mixture of fear and defiance. And little Lily, clinging to her mother, a fragile blossom in a world of thorns. They followed him, a hesitant procession trailing through the dense undergrowth, their footsteps disturbingly loud in the quiet woods that Jedediah had always considered his alone. The cabin, stark and utilitarian, offered little comfort beyond shelter. The air within was thick with the scent of pine and something else, a deep, lonely silence that was Jedediah's constant companion, now awkwardly invaded by the nervous shuffling of small feet and the low murmuring of a mother attempting to soothe her frightened brood. Jedediah moved with an economy of motion, tending to the fire, preparing a meager meal of salted pork and cornmeal porridge. He offered no pleasantries, no questions, his gaze unwavering, almost accusatory. Mary watched him, her movements cautious, like a small bird wary of a larger predator. She knew the precariousness of their situation, the fragility of this unexpected sanctuary. The children, initially huddled together, slowly began to explore, their curiosity overcoming their fear. Thomas, with his boyish bravado, eyed Jedediah's tools, a silent challenge in his gaze. Sarah, ever watchful, observed her mother and the silent woodsman, piecing together the unspoken tension that hummed between them. The contrast between Jedediah's stark solitude and their bewildered presence was palpable, a clash of two worlds, neither of which was prepared for the other. Each shared meal was a silent standoff, a negotiation of space and unspoken rules. Jedediah ate quickly, his eyes always scanning, always alert. Mary ate slowly, her gaze darting between her children and the imposing figure across the rough-hewn table, a fortress of silent strength that offered them refuge, but also held a palpable air of danger. The cabin, once a haven of solitary peace, now hummed with an unfamiliar energy, a fragile ecosystem teetering on the brink of an unknown future. The tension was thick, a heavy curtain draped over their forced coexistence, yet beneath it, an invisible thread began to weave itself, binding them in an unexpected, unsettling way. The quiet hum of their breathing, the crackle of the fire, the rustle of leaves outside, all sounds that used to signify peace now felt charged with an unspoken vulnerability. Word count 440. Days bled into weeks, each one a slow, arduous negotiation of shared space and unspoken boundaries. The initial awkwardness began to fray at the edges, revealing not comfort, but a different kind of friction, a grinding against long-held habits and ingrained defenses. Thomas, the boy, often tried to test Jedediah's patience, venturing too close to his tools, asking too many blunt questions. Jedediah, in turn, would respond with a gruff dismissal or a sharp, silent stare that sent the boy scurrying. Sarah, always observant, never asked direct questions, but her gaze held a silent inquiry, a persistent seeking of understanding that Jedediah found surprisingly unsettling. Little Lily, however, was different. Her innocence was a relentless chisel against Jedediah's formidable walls. She would sometimes approach him, her small hand reaching out tentatively, her big, trusting eyes reflecting his own stark image. He would freeze, unaccustomed to such unadulterated vulnerability, such pure, unthinking acceptance. A part of him recoiled, wary of the inherent weakness that came with tenderness, but another, deeper part, long dormant, felt a strange, unfamiliar stirring. Mary, too, was a constant, subtle presence. She was careful, always respectful of his space, Yet her very existence in his home was a constant reminder of the life he had chosen to abandon. She cleaned, she cooked, she mended, her quiet industry filling the cabin with an unaccustomed warmth. But behind her quiet efficiency, Jedediah sensed a deep, unyielding guard, a secret she held close, a story untold. She never spoke of her past, never explained how she came to be stranded in the wilderness with her children, but the unspoken mystery hung between them like a mist, thick and pervasive. He often caught her watching him, a quiet intensity in her gaze that spoke of both gratitude and a profound, lingering sadness. It was a gaze that pierced through his stoicism, reaching into the chamber he kept locked, searching for an understanding that he was unwilling to offer. The children's laughter, initially hesitant and rare, now occasionally echoed through the cabin, a foreign sound in his accustomed silence, a stark counterpoint to the wind's mournful song. It was a sound that simultaneously grated on his nerves, and yet, inexplicably, settled something within him, a rhythm of life he had long forgotten. He was a man of the earth, solitary and self-sufficient, but these new, fragile lives, dependent on his strength, were slowly, irrevocably intertwining with his own, beginning to alter the very contours of his being, leaving him exposed in ways he never anticipated. The forest, once his sanctuary, now seemed to press in, watching this delicate, tense alliance unfold. Word count, 446. The external pressures began subtly, like the first whisper of a coming storm. Jedediah's infrequent trips to the nearest town, a sparse cluster of dusty buildings and suspicious gazes, became increasingly fraught. The storekeeper, a man whose face was etched with a lifetime of petty judgments, offered curt service, his eyes lingering on Jedediah's purchases, the extra flour, the larger cuts of meat, with an unspoken question, a thinly veiled accusation. Whispers followed him like shadows, the sharp, barbed words of the townsfolk, their eyes narrowed in scrutiny. "Queer, that woodsman," one would mutter, loud enough for Jedediah to hear. "Living out there all alone, like some wild thing." But now, a new undercurrent laced their disdain. "Heard he's taken in a family, white folk, woman and children." The words were laced with venom, a blend of suspicion and blatant racial animosity. A black man taking in a white woman and her children was not merely unusual. It was an affront to their deeply ingrained societal order, a violation of their unspoken rules. Jedediah felt the weight of their judgment like a physical burden, a familiar oppression he had always sought to escape in the solitude of the woods. He had known the world outside his cabin was full of such narrow-mindedness, such hatred, but he had hoped his isolation would shield him from its sting. Now it was encroaching, threatening to shatter the fragile peace he had begrudgingly found. He found himself growing increasingly protective of the family, a fierce primal instinct rising within him. He was a flawed man, yes, scarred by his own past, but he was also a man of his word, and he had taken them in. A memory, unbidden and sharp, pierced through his stoicism, a flashback to his youth, a time when he had witnessed a similar injustice, a black family driven from their land by the cruel prejudice of others. He had been powerless then, a boy watching the world's ugliness unfold, and that powerlessness had festered, hardening into a deep-seated resolve to never be truly helpless again. That resolve, coupled with a deep-seated cynicism, had led him to this solitary life, believing that detachment was the only true defense. But now, with Mary and the children under his roof, their vulnerability became his, their struggles intertwining with his own. He was no longer just protecting himself, he was protecting them from a world that saw them as a scandal, an aberration. His silent commitment deepened, transforming from a reluctant charity into a fierce, almost desperate protectiveness, solidifying a bond he hadn't known he needed, but now felt deeply, inextricably woven into his very being. The weight of societal disapproval was a constant low thrum, urging him to retreat, but the nascent connection he felt to these vulnerable lives rooted him, pushing him to stand firm against the tide. Word count, 449. The fragile peace, already strained by the societal pressures, began to crack under the weight of an unexpected revelation. It started subtly, a fragment of conversation overheard, a glimpse of Mary's haunted expression when a particular topic arose. Jedediah, with his sharpened senses, began to notice the subtle shifts in her demeanor, the way she sometimes flinched at a sudden noise, the almost imperceptible tightening around her eyes when he spoke of the nearest town. One evening, after the children were asleep, the silence in the cabin was thick, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire. Mary, believing Jedediah was asleep, whispered a name into the darkness, a name Jedediah instinctively recognized as a man from the town, known for his cruelty, his landowning, and his widely rumored penchant for violence against those he deemed beneath him. Jedediah stirred, not feigning sleep but truly startled by the stark fear in her voice. He sat up, his gaze piercing the gloom. "What name was that?" he asked, his voice low, a rumbling current of suspicion. Mary flinched, her face paling in the firelight. The truth, long suppressed, began to surface, slow and painful. Her husband, she confessed, had been indebted to this man, a debt that turned into a binding servitude, a slow, suffocating stranglehold. When her husband died mysteriously and suddenly, the man claimed all their property, leaving Mary and her children destitute, threatening her with worse if she spoke of his dealings. She had fled, fearing for her children's lives, knowing the man's influence stretched far and wide. She had believed the wilderness was her only escape, a place where his reach could not extend. The air in the cabin grew thick, heavy with the weight of her untold suffering, her desperate flight, and the chilling realization of the true danger that still loomed. Jedediah felt a familiar bitterness rise within him, a cold anger at the systemic injustices that preyed on the vulnerable, particularly those without protection or voice. He had seen it before, countless times, the powerful crushing the powerless, the insidious corruption of societal norms masquerading as law and order. The man Mary named was a figure of local power, deeply embedded in the community's fabric, a stark embodiment of the societal biases and conflicts that had plagued Jedediah's own life. This wasn't just a widow and her children. It was a desperate, harrowing plea for justice, a challenge to his very moral core. The revelation was not merely a backstory. It was an incendiary device, setting off a chain reaction within Jedediah, transforming his reluctant hospitality into something far more profound and dangerous. The woods, once a sanctuary, now seemed to hold the echoes of their shared past, a haunting reminder that even in isolation, the tentacles of human cruelty could threaten to shatter the fragile haven he had built. His own experiences of being an outsider, a wild thing in the eyes of society, resonated deeply with Mary's story, forging a bond of shared vulnerability and defiance against a common unseen enemy. Word count, 445. The morning after Mary's revelation brought with it not just the usual chill of the mountain air, but a new, more profound coldness, the encroaching shadow of a direct threat. Jedediah had always known his isolated existence was a form of defiance, a quiet rejection of a world that sought to diminish him. Now that world was actively seeking to reclaim what it believed belonged to it, to reassert its cruel dominion. A rider approached the cabin, a lone figure cutting a stark silhouette against the rising sun, kicking up dust from the old logging road. Jedediah watched from the cabin window, his hand instinctively going to the axe leaning against the wall, his jaw set, a deep, grim resolve hardening his features. It was Elias Thorne, the man Mary had named, a hulking figure of menace, accompanied by two rough-looking deputies, their faces impassive, their presence a calculated show of force. Thorne dismounted, his eyes sweeping over the humble cabin, a sneer twisting his lips as he saw the children peeking from behind Mary's skirts. "Heard you've taken in a stray, Woodsman," Thorne drawled, his voice thick with contempt, his gaze lingering on Mary with a predatory glint. "Property of the late Miller family now, of course, under my protection, due to outstanding debts. And it appears now property of my rightful claim." He was not speaking of Mary's belongings. He was speaking of Mary herself, and by extension, her children. The implication hung heavy in the air, a chilling testament to the era's brutal injustices, the way human beings could be reduced to chattel. Jedediah stepped out, his tall frame blocking the doorway, a silent, imposing barrier. His face was unreadable, his eyes dark pools of simmering intensity. "She ain't property," Jedediah stated, his voice low, a gravelly rumble that carried an unyielding defiance. "She's a woman. These are her children. Thorn laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound that grated on Jedediah's nerves. "You think you can just take what's mine, black man? There are laws in this land, and they ain't for the likes of you to ignore." The racial slur was a deliberate barb, meant to provoke, to diminish, to assert dominance. Jedediah's hands clenched, but his face remained a mask of stone. He knew that any direct confrontation would be futile, leading to their immediate arrest, or worse. He was a man of the woods, not a lawyer, not a fighter of systems, but he was also a man who had seen too much injustice, a man who had chosen to shelter these desperate souls. He would not stand by and watch them be consumed by the very forces he had spent a lifetime escaping. The silence that followed his words was thick with unspoken threats, a silent negotiation of power and resistance. Mary, watching from the doorway, gripped her children tightly, her face a stark canvas of terror. Jedediah knew this was not just about survival. It was about dignity, about asserting a fundamental human right against the crushing weight of systemic cruelty. He saw the path before him, stark and perilous, a choice between his lifelong solitude and a battle he had no guarantee of winning, but also one he could not, would not, refuse. The tension was a palpable, suffocating force, a storm gathering over their unlikely sanctuary. Word count, 446. The confrontation was brutal, not with fists, but with words, with the crushing weight of legal pretense cloaking raw power. Thorn, infuriated by Jedediah's quiet defiance, unleashed his final, most devastating blow, a court order, flimsy yet official, stating that Mary and her children were to be removed from Jedediah's care and placed into Thorn's custody for their protection, a thinly veiled guise for forced labor and effective enslavement. He had bribed a local judge, twisted truths, leveraged his influence, painting Jedediah as a dangerous, unstable recluse who had abducted the family. The townsfolk, gathered at a cautious distance, watched with a morbid fascination, their faces a mix of suspicion and ingrained prejudice. The air was thick with the scent of fear and injustice. Jedediah felt a cold, burning rage coil in his gut, a familiar sensation he had long suppressed. He had seen this play out before, the law used as a weapon against the vulnerable, the system rigged against those without power or privilege. His own past, a tangle of injustices and forced retreat, screamed at him. He could not fight the law with his bare hands, not this law, not here, but he could fight it with his mind, with the raw, desperate strength of a man who had nothing left to lose but the fragile connections he had found. "You got no right," Jedediah rasped, his voice strained, raw, his gaze locked on Thorn's cruel eyes. "They chose to come here." Thorn merely smirked, a triumphant glint in his eyes. "Choice ain't something they got, Woodsman. Not anymore." The unspoken threat was clear: comply or suffer the consequences. For the first time, Jedediah saw the terror in Mary's eyes, naked and absolute. He saw Sarah's trembling lip, Thomas's defiant but ultimately helpless stance, Lily's confused cry. He knew then that retreat was not an option. He had to choose: his solitude, his carefully constructed peace, or the desperate, impossible fight for these lives who had, against all odds, carved a place in his barren heart. This was the pivotal moment, the emotional climax towards which every silent observation, every terse word, every suppressed feeling had been building. It was the moment where his flawed, morally ambiguous nature was stripped bare, revealing a core of fierce, unwavering loyalty. He was a man of the earth, primal and unyielding, and now he stood ready to defend his own, not with brute force, but with a deep, visceral commitment that transcended law, fear, and prejudice. The stakes were no longer just survival. They were about humanity, about the very essence of what it meant to protect, to belong, to be found. The sun, a brutal, indifferent eye, cast long, distorted shadows, making giants of the cruel and shrinking the desperate, as Jedediah's silent struggle intensified, hardening into a defiant, unshakable resolve. Word count, 449. In the aftermath of the confrontation, the air in the cabin was thick with a silence deeper than any Jedediah had ever known, a profound, aching stillness that swallowed even the whispers of the wind. Thorn and his men had left, but not empty-handed. Jedediah, in a desperate last-ditch gamble, had offered them everything he possessed, his entire life savings, the meager sum hoarded from years of hard labor and trading timber. It was a crippling blow, a sacrifice that left him utterly destitute, a man stripped bare of all his worldly possessions. But it bought Mary and the children their freedom, their lives, their continued precarious existence by his side. It was a bargain struck in desperation, a testament to the fact that some things were worth more than any coin, any comfort, any personal security. He sat by the dying embers of the fire, his shoulders slumped, his powerful hands, usually so decisive, now hanging limp and empty. He was physically exhausted, mentally drained, but beneath the weariness, a strange, unexpected sensation bloomed, a profound, aching sense of purpose. He had been a man of solitude, a man who believed detachment was strength, that self-preservation was the highest virtue. He had run from connection, from the messy, demanding truths of human relationships, seeing only the pain, the burden, the inevitable loss. Now, staring into the flickering light, he understood the irony of his journey. In losing everything, he had gained something immeasurable. His flaws, his cynicism, his guarded heart, they had all been challenged, broken down, and rebuilt. He was still Jedediah, still a man of the woods, still carrying the deep scars of his past, but he was also something new. He was a protector, a guardian, a provider. He was inextricably tied to these lives that had so unexpectedly crashed into his own. Mary, observing him from across the small cabin, understood. Her eyes, no longer filled with fear, held a deep, unshakable gratitude, a quiet understanding of the immense sacrifice he had made. The children, initially bewildered by the departure of the cruel men, now watched Jedediah with a new reverence, a recognition of the fierce, quiet love that had saved them. The cabin, once a place of stark solitude, now held a different energy, a fragile, hard-won peace. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the quiet hum of shared breath, the subtle movements of sleeping bodies, the unspoken bond that stretched between them, woven from sacrifice and the deep, dark soil of human connection. Jedediah had always been a man alone, but now, even in his quiet exhaustion, he felt a strange sense of belonging, a profound truth settling within him. The dark had been confronted, and from its depths, a tender, fragile hope had begun to take root. Word count 442. The days that followed were a testament to resilience, a slow, painstaking reconstruction of a life stripped bare. Jedediah, now utterly without resources, was forced to redefine his existence. He had to rely on his ingenuity, his deep knowledge of the forest, and an unspoken, communal understanding that had been forged in the crucible of shared adversity. Mary, too, took on a new role, her quiet strength emerging as a foundational pillar in their new, fragile equilibrium. She learned to forage more extensively, to mend clothes with a resourcefulness born of necessity, to stretch every meager meal. The children, sensing the profound shift, grew quieter, more self-reliant, their innocence tempered by the harsh realities they had witnessed. Thomas, once defiant, now looked at Jedediah with a nascent respect, often helping him with tasks, his small hands eager to contribute. Sarah, ever watchful, became Jedediah's shadow, absorbing his knowledge of the forest, learning the subtle language of survival. Little Lily, still clinging, still trusting, became the soft anchor, her innocent laughter a reminder of the precious life they had fought so hard to preserve. The dynamic between them was no longer one of reluctant host and grateful refugees. It was a complex, interwoven tapestry of mutual dependence and unspoken affection. Jedediah, the deeply flawed man who had fled the world, now found himself utterly entwined with it, bound by threads of love and responsibility. His moral ambiguity had been tested, refined, and ultimately grounded in the stark reality of his choices. He was still terse, still guarded, but his eyes, once so distant, now held a glimmer of something akin to warmth, a softened edge to their customary intensity. The woods, once his solitary domain, now felt like a shared home, its vastness filled not with loneliness, but with the quiet, comforting presence of others. The wind, his oldest companion, still lamented, but now it carried the faint echoes of children's voices, the murmur of conversation, the sounds of a family forged not by blood, but by fire. He was no longer just the woodsman, the recluse, the isolated figure. He was a father figure, a protector, a provider. He was, profoundly and irrevocably, a part of something larger than himself. The dark, intense moments had given way to a quieter, more grounded reality, where hope was not a grand declaration, but a quiet, persistent hum in the background of their daily lives. His heart, once a sealed chamber, had been pried open, not without pain, but with a profound and lasting transformation. The meaning of lonely had shifted, replaced by a deep, resonant sense of belonging that finally filled the hollow space within him. Word count, 448. Life settled into a rhythm, stark and demanding, yet imbued with a quiet purpose that had long eluded Jedediah. The cabin, once a symbol of his solitary defiance, was now undeniably a home, filled with the bustling chaos of children, the quiet industry of Mary, and the deep, silent presence of Jedediah himself. He still moved through the woods with the same practiced ease. His axe still sang its familiar song against the timber, but the motivations behind his actions had fundamentally shifted. Every swing, every hunt, every laborious task was no longer just for his own survival. It was for them. They had become his anchors, his reason, the very heart of his existence. He was a man deeply flawed, yes, his past a mosaic of shadows and unspoken burdens, but in the crucible of their shared struggle, a profound transformation had taken place. His moral ambiguity had not vanished, but it had been refined, tempered by a fierce, protective love that transcended the simple binaries of right and wrong. He had chosen them, against all odds, against the world's judgment, and in doing so, he had chosen himself, a version of himself he never knew could exist. The societal figures, with their narrow minds and their cruel judgments, faded into the background, their power diminished by the simple, unyielding truth of their shared lives. Their whispers still reached the woods, carried on the wind, but they no longer held the same sting. Jedediah had found a deeper truth, a more profound sense of belonging than any societal acceptance could offer. He was no longer merely surviving. He was living, truly living, in a way he had never thought possible. The quiet moments, the shared meals by the fire, the children's easy laughter, Mary's gentle, understanding gaze, these were the new cornerstones of his world. They were the poetry in his otherwise stark existence, the vibrant colors in a life once rendered in shades of gray. He watched them sometimes from the doorway, his heart a strange mixture of gratitude and the lingering ache of a past he could never fully escape, yet one that now felt distant, less painful. He had taken in a widow and her children, not knowing they would become his life, but they had, irrevocably and completely. Their arrival, once a terrifying intrusion, had been the catalyst for his own rebirth, transforming a lonely black woodsman into a man defined not by his solitude, but by the profound, enduring connections he had forged in the heart of the wild. The forest, ancient and wise, continued its silent watch, a witness to the remarkable testament of human resilience, of love found in the most unlikely of places, blooming like a wildflower in the deepest, most shadowed parts of the woods, a vibrant testament to hope and resolution. Word count 442.